Welcome to the London History Podcast. I am Hazel Baker, tour guide and CEO of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Today we are looking into the life of one of Britain's most famous orphans, a figure whose story begins in hardship, yet goes on to shape literature, imagination, and even how we think about childhood itself. Orphans have a long captured public sympathy and creative fascination, embodying both vulnerability and resilience. But the orphan at the heart of today's story is more than a character on a page or a tragic tale from the past. So, join me as we step back into the world that shaped him, the workhouses, the streets of London, and the changing attitudes towards poverty, charity, and social responsibility. This is not just the tale of an orphan, but how one boy came to symbolise hope, survival, and the fight for dignity in the most difficult of circumstances. First appearing in print in 1837, Oliver Twist is no fairy tale foundling. He is a child of the workhouse, born into poverty and forced to navigate a city of crime, cruelty and corruption. His story shocked Victorian readers because it didn't flinch from exposing the brutal realities of child poverty, hunger and exploitation, issues that many preferred not to see. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But Oliver Twist is more than just a character. He became a symbol. For Dickens, Oliver was the innocent at the mercy of a system that failed him at every single turn. For readers, he was both a mirror and a moral test. Would they too want some more? In this episode, we will trace Oliver's world from the workhouse to the London rookeries and explore how Dickens's most enduring orphan helped to shape not only the novel itself, but public debate about the city and the society that created him. Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist in monthly instalments from 1837 to 1839, just as London was hurtling into the Victorian age. What makes a novel so enduring is not simply Oliver's plight, but the way the city itself looms over the story. London isn't merely a backdrop. It is a character in its own right, suffocating, dangerous, and yet strangely full of possibility. Many of the novel's most memorable episodes are tied to recognisable districts of the capital. Dickens blended real geography with fictional invention, producing a cityscape that felt familiar to contemporary readers and compellingly atmospheric. He often walked the streets himself at night, making mental notes of alleys, courts and slums that resurfaced in his fiction. Take, for example, Oliver's arrival in London. After fleeing the workhouse and then his apprenticeship with the undertaker, exhausted, starving and bewildered, he trudges along the Great North Road and finally ends in Barnet. This is where he meets a boy a little shorter than him, a little scruffier than him, but certainly with a twinkle in his eye. That boy is the Artful Dodger, and he offers Oliver an introduction to a gentleman who can provide him with food, lodgings, and not want any rent. Too good to be true? Of course it is. But Oliver Twist, with little alternative, follows the Artful Dodger into the bowels of London. And that's exactly what we do on my Oliver Twist walking tour. We start at Angel and work our way into London itself, looking at what Oliver and the Artful Dodger, had they been real, what they would have experienced, walking those streets and following the words of Dickens from chapter 8. Dickens's readers would have instantly recognised London, the setting where one was a vulnerable child and could easily fall into danger. And danger could come in different shapes and sizes. Artful Dodger, who leads him to Fagin's den, while Dickens never exactly pins down the address, scholars often place the gang's lair in the labyrinth of narrow lanes around Saffron Hill. Now, in the 1830s, this district was described as the most notorious rookery in London. Dickens's readers would have instantly recognised the setting as one of where A vulnerable child might easily fall into danger. And of course, danger comes in all different shapes and sizes. It is the artful dodger who leads him to Fagin's den. While Dickens never pins down the exact dress, scholars often find the gang's lair in the labyrinth of narrow lanes in and around Saffron Hill. In the 1830s, the district was described as the most notorious rookery in London, home to dilapidated houses crammed with families, pickpockets and street traders. Henry Mayhew later wrote about the stench, noise and crowding were almost beyond belief. It was a world where the boundary between survival and criminality was perilously thin. We do cover this and some of the exploitation of children in episode 134, Organ Grinders of Little Italy, which is the same area. And then there's Jacob's Island in Bermondsey, the setting of the novel's violent climax. And Dickens paints it as the filthiest, the strangest, the most extraordinary of the many localities that are hidden in London. In reality, Jacob's Island was a network of tidal ditches off the Thames, lined with decaying workhouses and shanty-like dwellings. Visitors in the 1830s recorded children playing in water as black as ink and open sewers running beneath broken floorboards. It was the perfect place to stage Bill Sykes's desperate last stand, a physical manifestation of the moral corruption Dickens wished to expose. As the wheels of the Industrial Revolution turned, London's streets throbbed with ambition and invention. By the 1830s, the city was being remade almost overnight. Smokestacks rose above rooftops, railway lines slashed through farmland, and the air filled with the sounds of steam engines, printing presses, and the relentless clamour of mass production. Euston Station opened its great iron gates in 1837, one of the first of London's monumental railway termini. And it brought with it not only the thunder of locomotives, but an entire new rhythm of life. Clouds of coal smoke, the shuffle of passengers, and the constant vibration of progress. A reporter for the Morning Chronicle marvelled that the railway brought the far provinces to London's door, and no street was spared the dust and excitement. For families in rural villages, the lure of London was irresistible. They arrived from Kent, Devon, Yorkshire, sometimes with little more than the clothes they wore, dreaming of steady wages in the city's docks, factories or workshops. Yet for many, hope quickly soured. Opportunity was scarce, wages were low, and living conditions were harsh. The city's rapid growth came at a steep cost. Slums, known as rookeries, spread like a stain. Places such as Saffron Hill, Seven Dials, and St Giles became synonymous with overcrowding, vice, and squalor. Reforming investigator Edwin Chadwick described conditions in 1842. In London's courts and alleys, the atmosphere is dense with the perfumes of putrefaction. Sanitation lagged far behind the city's swelling population. Open drains ran along the streets. Cesspools overflowed into courtyards. The Thames itself, once celebrated as a royal river, was reduced to a dumping ground for refuse. As the Times thundered in 1839, "The state of the Thames is an abomination. It is the great open sewer of the metropolis." Disease was never far behind. Cholera struck with devastating force in 1832 and would return repeatedly in the decades that followed. Typhus and tuberculosis became everyday killers. In London's poorest parishes, life expectancy collapsed to under 35 years. And yet, just a mile or two away, the contrast was astonishing. The West End glittered with grand townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia, lit by gas lamps and attended by servants. Families here enjoyed clean water, regular laundering, and manicured squares, as the chronicler Henry Mayhew would later remark. London is two cities, one rich, one poor, one thriving, the other rotting. This deep divide provided the backdrop to Dickens's fiction. When readers encountered Oliver wandering the city, they recognised the real geography, the rookery and the townhouse, the gin shop and the gentleman's club. But the inequality of London in Dickens's day was not just social, it was legislated. In 1834, Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, a measure hailed by some as reform and denounced by others as cruelty. Its chief architect, Lord Althorp, insisted, "We must make the condition of the pauper less eligible than that of the independent labourer." Gone was the patchwork system of local charity, and in its place London was divided into unions, each governed by a board of guardians. The centrepiece of the Act was the workhouse, designed not to help, but to deter, as Edwin Chadwick explains. The workhouse test would become a deterrent, not a support. The pauper must pass a trial, not receive succour. Inside these institutions, labour was monotonous and exhausting. Stone breaking, oakum picking, endless cleaning. Meals were scant. Bread, thin gruel, and little else. For many, the system stripped away dignity along with sustenance. Outdoor relief, where families could receive aid while remaining in their homes, was virtually abolished. Poverty had become a moral failing, to be punished with discipline and hunger. Critics raged against it. The historian Thomas Carlyle thundered, "What is the use of a system which starves virtue and rewards vice with insults and brickbats?" This was the London of Oliver Twist, a city of invention and dislocation, of wealth and privatisation. It was in these divided communities, amid roaring factories, glittering boulevards, and festering slums, that Dickens set his tale, forcing people to confront the urgent truths of their own time. Childhood in 19th century London was rarely the protected stage of life we imagine today. For the majority, it was a time of hardship, work, and survival. The social investigator Henry Mayhew once reported, "Of the climbing boys, the sweeps, the match sellers, I counted a score in 1 hour, all under the age of 13. Children were everywhere on the streets of the capital, working up to 14 hours a day. They swept crossings, sold matches, carried water, or toiled in grim factories. Chimney sweeps, often no older than 8 or 9, they were prized for their small size and their ability to wriggle through narrow flues coated with soot. Many suffered burns, suffocation, or the slow disease known as sootwort. Orphaned or abandoned children had even fewer choices. The city's crowded alleys provided little protection, and they became easy prey for exploitation, whether as cheap labour, petty thieves, or beggars under the control of unscrupulous adults. Dickens's portrayal of Oliver under Fagin's tutelage was not mere invention. It reflected the very real networks of child crime that authorities struggled to contain. Education was scarce. A handful of Sunday schools and ragged schools fought to teach basic literacy, often relying on charitable donations and volunteer teachers. For most poor children, though, the only institution open to them was the workhouse, once a refuge, a prison, and a place of punishment. In 1837, pamphlet issued to the Boarders of Guardians captured the unease of the time. "Are we breeding a generation for the treadwheel and the gallows, or for the shop and the parish?" And so, when we picture Oliver Twist wandering the streets of London, we must also picture the children who inspired him. Barefoot boys hawking matches at street corners, girls carrying baskets through the rain, chimney sweeps coughing soot into handkerchiefs. Hope and despair mingled in every alley. Charles Dickens, a writer whose own life in 1837 was as dramatic and layered as any of his novels. At just 25 years old, Dickens was already a household name. The Pickwick Papers had been his first great success, and he had taken Britain by storm. His domestic life seemed happy, at least at first. In 1836, he had married Catherine Hogarth, daughter of a respected critic. By January 1837, their first child, Charles Jr., had been born. Dickens wrote with evident pride, "My domestic happiness is complete. My little boy is already the delight of our house." But joy was swiftly overshadowed by tragedy. In May that same year, Catherine's younger sister Mary Hogarth, only 17 years old, died suddenly while living with the couple. Dickens was devastated. In his journal he confessed, "The loss has so unsettled me. I find it hard to work or concentrate upon my labours." Many scholars believe Mary's death left a lasting mark on his imagination, shaping the figures of innocence and suffering in his fiction, characters such as Rose Maylie in Oliver Twist. Beneath this public and private turbulence lay the deep scars of Dickens's childhood. At 12, he was forced into Warren's blacking factory near Hungerford Stairs, pasting labels for hours in grim, rat-infested rooms. His father, John Dickens, was imprisoned for debt at the Marshalsea, leaving young Charles effectively abandoned and responsible for his family's upkeep. He never recovered from the humiliation. Years later, he confessed, "No words can express the secret agony of my soul. I suffered far too much to ever forget it." That experience runs like a dark current through Oliver Twist. The cruelty of workhouses, the vulnerability of children, and the city as both oppressor and saviour. Dickens's own life that year moved in step with Oliver's journey, a restless search for meaning, a confrontation with suffering, and an unrelenting belief that stories could awaken a nation's conscience. Our first location today is in Cleveland Street, just off Tottenham Court Road, where the Strand Union Workhouse once stood. At first glance, its brick walls and plain facade might not have looked especially remarkable, but inside it was a place that seared itself into the imaginations of all who walked through its gates. For Charles Dickens, who lived nearby as a boy, the workhouse was not an abstract institution. It was part of the landscape of his own life, one of the grim realities that shaped both his outlook and his fiction. In Oliver Twist, Dickens describes a workhouse, a large stone building, with a high paved yard in front and a grim stone step at the door, as cold and heartless as the faces within. And of course, it was within those walls that young Oliver dared to utter the most famous plea in Victorian literature. "Please, sir, I want some more." In that simple request, so shocking to Dickens's readers, was not a fantasy. It reflected the lived truth of thousands of children for whom hunger was constant and compassion rare. The workhouse system, formalised by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, was designed to make relief for the poor deliberately harsh. Conditions were made as grim as possible in order to deter what the authorities called idleness. Families who crossed the threshold of Cleveland Street were torn apart, husbands separated from wives, mothers from their children. For those inside, the workhouse was not charity, it was punishment. And Dickens himself once confessed in a letter, "I have always felt weariness of spirit at the sight of that prison house for want and misfortune." And prison house is exactly the right word. Workhouses were locked institutions. Inmates lived under strict routines, ate food that was often inadequate or barely edible, and endured surveillance from masters that could be indifferent, or worse, cruel. The Strand Union Workhouse was particularly notorious. In the 1830s and 1840s, Official reports show overcrowding was chronic. Sometimes 400 inmates crammed within its walls. The diet was monotonous: gruel, bread, and the occasional scrap of meat. Children were put to work, often in menial tasks with little or no education. For Dickens, who at the age of 12 had been forced into child labour at Warren's blacking factory, while his family languished in Marshalsea prison, these were not abstractions. They were the echoes of his own childhood suffering. And that is what makes Oliver's world so haunting. The workhouse in Oliver Twist is not just a backdrop. It is Dickens's own indictment of a system that dehumanised the vulnerable. When Oliver dares to ask for more food, it's not just a child asking for nourishment. It is Dickens himself crying out to a society that punished poverty instead of alleviating it. Contemporary commentators painted the same picture. A poor law inspector noted in 1836, "The workhouse is not a refuge for the poor, but a warning to them." And the Times thundered against the system in its editorials, pointing out the cruelty of separating children from their parents, condemning it as an assault upon the very fabric of family life. To walk past Cleveland Street in Dickens's time was to see these realities up close. Imagine for a moment young Dickens as a boy, walking past the gates of the workhouse. Behind those walls were children just like him. They were enduring cold and hunger and loss. This sight never left him, and decades later it surfaced in the pages of Oliver Twist. Today the workhouse is long gone, but some of the building remains and is now 2 townhouses and 13 apartments with a starting price of £1,025,000. Cleveland Street symbolises something larger than bricks and mortar. It represents the Victorian belief that poverty was a personal failing to be corrected with discipline rather than compassion. And Dickens never forgot that cruelty, and through his writing he ensured that we would not either. Next, let me take you by the hand as we slip into the shadowy labyrinth of Saffron Hill and Field Lane, a rookery alive with the pulse of Victorian London's underbelly. The air here is thick, the daylight barely squeezing between leaning tenements, and every cobblestone seems to murmur tales of hardship and cunning. Picture it. You turn a corner off bustling Holborn and step into a squalid street full of filth and misery, the haunt of the lowest and most debased of London's population, as Dickens himself wrote. The noises change: shouts, whispers, laughter tumbling from gin shops, the clatter of boot-black boys dashing for a penny, the slower shuffle of the weary and the desperate. The very walls close in, patched and shuttered, holding secrets in every crack. This isn't just a novelist's fancy. Edwin Chadwick, reporting on the Slums, wrote, "The abodes of poverty hold upwards of 20 persons in 2 rooms. Imagine the press of bodies, the smell of damp and decay, and a thrum of life. Children sleeping beneath tables, mothers boiling what little food they could find, and shadows moving in doorways, always watching." A local constable, Charles Cochrane, patrolled these maze-like lanes, and he remarked, "Here the thief and the beggar rub shoulders daily." The boundary between an honest meal and a stolen purse could be measured in inches. Every step, every doorway is edged with risk and necessity. Here Fagin's den sits out of sight, but within earshot of every commotion, its cellars and back rooms crowded with ill-got spoils, and sharp-eyed boys, like the Artful Dodger, forever on the lookout for the next opportunity. But for all its notoriety, Saffron Hill and Field Lane are more than a backdrop. They are the living organism, nourished by struggle and ingenuity, a place where hope flickers for some, even as the law closes in. For Dickens, these narrow, oppressive lanes were the soil from which London's criminal world sprang, a world not so far removed from the city's respectable heart, and one he invites us to walk with caution and empathy at his side. Next, let's linger to the cold, looming walls of Newgate Prison, a place in Dickens's London where hope flickers and dies, and justice takes its most merciless form. In the closing chapters of Oliver Twist, the notorious villain Fagin is finally caught and led through the crowded, dirty streets from his den in Saffron Hill and delivered to Newgate's iron gates. This is not just any jail, it is the end point for so many in Dickens's world. Dickens' description is chilling. A vaulted chamber, lighted by a single narrow grating. The walls and floor were black and damp. The streets were alive at every hour, but here all was still as the grave. Time stretches, and alone in the darkness, Fagin's bravado crumbles. It becomes not the arch enemy, but a desperate man haunted by nightmares and memory. He pleads, "What right have you to butcher me?" But the machinery of the justice system is cold, remote. Dickens refuses to glorify it. The stench, the cries, the faces pressed to the bars. I have never left Newgate, nor has it left me. Dickens once wrote after a visit, and his horror at the institution seeps into every page. The public executions outside Newgate drew thousands, rich and poor, curious and fearful, all gathering to witness the spectacle, as Thomas Carlyle thundered. The machinery of justice and suffering, unyielding and unfeeling. In Oliver Twist, the judge is distant, the proceedings intimidating, mercy a scare commodity. Dickens offers this. There are few among the crowded gazers who do not find something in the gaunt, pale face that speaks to them of suffering, of the distance between law and charity. Fagin's death in Newgate's vaults is not just the end of one criminal, but a devastating reminder of the system's brutal finality. The labyrinth of London streets might deliver Oliver to danger, but the justice system offers little relief, and its ultimate mercy comes, if at all, too late. So, as you stand in your imagination outside those walls echoing with footsteps, laments, and the toll of the church bell, remember Fagin not just as a villain, but as a victim of a system Dickens so urgently wanted to change. Behind every verdict and every bar, Dickens found a story, a plea for reform and for compassion. There is so much of Dickens's London that we could explore, but this is part one of, I'm sure, what will be many. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Oliver Twist's London. As a tour guide and a lover of London's untold stories, I hope this episode has deepened your sense not only of the city's geography, but its heart and conscience. If these streets have enthralled you, remember you can walk them for yourself, on foot, with history as your companion, or with me on one of our guided walks. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the London History Podcast, leave a review, and share your own reflections on Dickens's city. If you'd like to experience Dickens's London firsthand, I'd love to show you around. I offer 2 Dickens-themed walking tours. My original Oliver Twist walking tour, tracing the boy's footsteps in Chapter 8 from Angel in Islington all the way to Fagin's lair, giving you a real sense of the story's atmosphere and locations. And for all of you Christmas enthusiasts, my Christmas Carol walking tour is a festive favourite. We already have several public walk dates lined up for the season, including, yes, Christmas Eve itself. It's a perfect way to get into the spirit, whether you're a long-time Dickens fan or just curious about London at its most magical. And of course, private tours for both are always available and can be easily booked online at londonguidedwalks.co.uk. If you have any questions or special requests, drop me a line. I'll be delighted to help you plan your Dickens adventure. Come along and step into the pages of Dickensian London history with me. There's always more to discover. Next time, we'll step into a new chapter of London's past. Who knows what stories await the next corner? Next time, we'll step into a Christmassy chapter of London's past. Who knows what stories await round the corner? Until next time.